let's get started with the objectives for this session, this short session, which will hopefully be useful for everybody. In the first place, we are going to identify and acknowledge what the current situation is like. Then we're going to find out how the learning loss situation is addressed in different teaching contexts, because this concept of learning loss is something that is being documented globally. It's not only happening in our case, in the classroom, in ELT, it's happening everywhere. So the most important thing, and it's our third objective, we're going to explore some practical learning recovery strategies. So let's move on to our first objective. What is the situation? In the next slide, we are going to focus on what is happening and what I like to call a double gap. The title of this session is Mind the Learning Gap. And if you can, Will, could you do me a favor? Could you please move on to the next slide so that we can focus more on this double gap idea? Thank you. This double gap idea, because there's the gap that we see if we compare pre-pandemic and current levels, what was happening or what was expected to happen, and what is actually happening now, the level that we see in the classroom as we come back after 2 years, 2.5 years of whatever, distance learning, hybrid modes, online learning, not being on campus in what was normal for us before. So there's that gap, but there is also the gap between our more resilient and less resilient learners. And once again, this is something that we saw in the past. Learning loss was sometimes used as a concept talking after the summer holiday. After 3 months, there was some learning loss, but now we're talking about a much wider gap. And especially in mixed ability classes, we always saw a gap between more advanced learners and less advanced learners. But now we also see that some of our learners became very resilient and still made a lot or quite a lot of progress during the 2 or 2.5 years of the pandemic. And those that were less resilient or who had less access to resources or to technology, those really fell behind. So we have this double gap, as I like to call it. Our second objective was to find out and have an idea what's happening around the world. How is learning loss addressed? And there are 2 models that I will speak about very briefly. The first one is remediation, and it is symbolized by the Band-Aids. And the other one is acceleration, which is symbolized by the racing cars. So as I briefly explain these 2 models, think about your situation. Think about your teaching context. In your case, with the learning loss situations that you have experienced, are you using a remediation model? Are you trying to use an acceleration model? Are you not doing anything about it yet because you really don't know how to go about it? And there's room for a couple more options. So let's focus now on remediation. This is a strategy or a technique that focuses on teaching the missed content, kind of going back and teaching what we see our learners have not learned, or what we have not had the time to teach. The rationale is very clear. Learners need the review. They need to learn what came before to be able to learn what's coming up next. But there are some disadvantages. Constantly providing instruction below grade level can actually make the situation worse, not better. There is no challenge in this, and it can even perpetuate the inequities, those gaps that we were talking about. So it can actually be worse. There's the other model, the model of acceleration, which is in the next slide. And we are going to focus on some of these rationales and also disadvantages. The acceleration model focuses on extra support. The focus of acceleration is on extra support, but, and this is a big but, while teaching grade level materials, while teaching the grade level curriculum. So the teachers within specific support to address the gaps as the learners continue to move forward. This model makes a lot of sense. It also has some disadvantages. To begin with, more demands on the teachers. We need more time to assess, we need more time to plan, and we need to add more things to a lesson. It also requires more collaboration, because we not only need more time as teachers, we also need to spend more time maybe with peers, maybe with mentor teachers, with people that can help us and guide us. And of course, it requires more resources. So at this point, you may want to tell us if you feel that you have used an acceleration model or more of a remedial model. And you are more than welcome to type it into the chat box so that we can see your responses. And while you do that, while you respond to that question, which of the two models have you been using or you think you may have been using? Acceleration or remedial model? And in the next slide, I'm going to share with you the results of a survey, because we want to see what's happening in the world to then have a better idea what's happening in our classroom in the ELT world. So let's move on to the next slide while you think about whether it's more of an acceleration model or a remedial model that you have been using. This is from the US, from the United States. It's a publication that is called Education Week, independent. It's an independent news organization. And this is about what is happening in general education, not the ELT world, the general world of education, both at primary and secondary school levels. And what teachers, principals, and district leaders are saying is that they are using, for the most part, 65% of the time, a mixture of both. And Jacqueline is also saying, I have used both. So Jacqueline, you would go into this 65%, right? She's saying depending, of course, depending on the level of the group. And other people are saying, I have used more of a remedial approach. Oh, right. For example, with weaker classes, makes a lot of sense. Well, other people are saying acceleration. Well, as you can see, there's room for all of those options in this survey. Most of the teachers say that they have used a mixture of these, and more say that they have used remediation than acceleration. And there is a small group of teachers that say, teachers and administrators, that say other or maybe not much yet. Let's move on to what's happening. Let's cross the Atlantic. In the next slide, we will see something from the UK, Once again, it's not about the ELT world. This is happening across the board globally. This is recovery in STEM. STEM stands, as you probably know, for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And this is information from a British organization called STEAM Learning. And these are the techniques that they have identified as useful strategies to address learning loss. First of all, the use of diagnostics to determine the gaps. Then focus on learning recovery and resources to be able to do it, coupled with high quality teaching and an ambitious curriculum. So as you can probably see, this sounds more like acceleration than remedial. Let's move on to the next slide to see something that I hope will be very practical, an idea on how to address learning loss in our classes. This is based on a differentiation model created by Carol Ann Tomlinson. Tomlinson has worked on differentiation research, strategies, publications for decades. And a lot of the work has also been updated, and I think it's a perfect match for the learning loss situation and that double gap that I was talking about at the beginning. It's a series of steps that can be very useful as a lesson plan. And as you can see, it's a wavy line because it's not a straight timeline. It starts off with pre-assessment. That's the first thing. We need to pre-assess. We need to know where our learners are. We need to know what their gaps are. Then we move into whole class work, which may be whole class introduction, modeling, demonstrating, a mini lesson. Then after that comes small group work. This is work that has been planned, prepared, and that is assigned by levels so that we can address the gaps where needed and we can move on to something more challenging for those learners that are ready. After that comes again the whole class work. In this case, it may be whole class share. It may be followed by questions. This is also a great time to do further formative assessment or assessment for formative purposes to see once again where our learners are. This is followed by class review and then again small group work, which is once again by level. Depending on how long our lessons are, this may be more than enough for one lesson. The next steps may be for the following lesson, but in a longer lesson, in a longer block of time, we may also be able to complete this wavy line or this cycle with more whole group wrap up, with the introduction of some new concepts or ideas or activities, and once again followed by small group work. And in this case, it can still be by level or it can be by interest. So this is a very basic idea, the flow of a lesson and how it can go. And I want to wrap this up with 10 strategies, very specific strategies that we can use in the classroom and which will help with learning loss. I have selected only 10 differentiation strategies that are low prep. I'm afraid there are no non-prep strategies. Good teaching always requires planning, prepping, but these are strategies that do not take so long to prepare. First of all,
Claudia, can I interrupt
mini
you?
lessons. Sure, go ahead.
You gave me permission. I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you there. I've got a question, if that's all right. So someone's asking what type of can you tell us a bit more about the pre-assessments?
Yes,
what type of pre-assessments would be? Reading, grammar, listening, skills?
Right. Well, there are two sides to the pre-assessment tasks, because we need to consider what tasks, what techniques we are going to use to pre-assess, and we need to consider the content that we are assessing. It can become a grid, and it can be as complicated or as complex or as simple as we want to make it. In other words, different kinds of tasks. We're not talking about summative assessments. We're not talking about tests, but we can use pre-tests too. We can use speaking activities. We can use writing activities. We can use an informal chat with the whole class. We can use a specific game in which what we do is listen in, take notes, and decide where our learners are and what they need. So the other part of the grid is, what are we assessing? Are we assessing pronunciation? Are we assessing the use of a specific grammar point? Are we assessing fluency? Are we assessing accuracy? Are we assessing a specific language function that is part of our learning objectives? So we need to consider the learning objectives to decide what we are assessing, and we need to consider the tasks, the how we do it and how we document it. Does that make sense?
It does. Thanks very much, Claudia. Thanks for going into it so well. Thanks a lot.
And we could do 20 minutes, 1 hour, or 5 hours on pre-assessment or assessment in general. The important thing here is that, first of all, we need to know where our learners are, and we need to know what the gaps are. Not as a whole group only, but also so that we can determine those small groups where we're going to focus more on what they need specifically. Does that answer the question? Does that make sense?
It does, very much.
Great. So let's go back to the 10 low prep differentiation strategies. The first one, mini lessons. Instead of a long lesson on something, a mini lesson is 5 minutes, 10 minutes in which we present something. It can also be a workshop in which we ask our learners to do something. And mini lessons can be used both for whole group, in the big group introduction or wrap up. They can also be used when we start working with the small groups that are differentiated and that will have differentiated activities to do. Another low prep differentiation strategy is using flexible grouping, flexible seating. The small group that needs to review a grammar point might be different from the group that needs to review some vocabulary or a specific language function. So we are constantly regrouping our learners so that they can get what they need. Open-ended activities, that's the third strategy and very useful. for differentiation and for learning loss recovery. Activities that have more than one option, more than one possibility. Fourth strategy, we need a range of materials at different levels and on different interests. And I know that there are a lot of fantastic activities and resources in the Macmillan website that you can use for this. The fifth strategy that I'm going to recommend is a variety of note-taking formats. Some of our learners require a more structured kind of note-taking chart, for example. Some of our learners require something less structured. Some of them might even be ready for bullet points in which they take notes in any way they want. So using a variety of note-taking formats is a low prep differentiation strategy that can go a long way. So these are the first 5. And in our next slide, we're going to see 5 more. Variety of questions. When we're doing whole group discussion, we need to make sure that we are using questions to address all the levels. So we need open-ended questions, closed questions, provocative questions, guiding questions, so that everybody gets something to think about. Number 6, teacher-student goal setting. In big classes, this is a big challenge, but it's still possible to spend some time one-on-one talking with our learners once a week, once every 2 weeks, even if it's once a month, it's better than nothing, in which we help our learners set their goals for improvement. Another strategy that is low prep and very effective for differentiation, using word banks, using different word banks. Some of them are more for our more advanced learners. Some word banks may be simpler, more basic, a little bit for everybody. Then, of course, pair work and sharing. I know that we have all used think, pair, share, and similar strategies. Those are great for differentiation. And number 10, the last one, is to use sentence and paragraph frames. That is, different sentence starters or different kind of fill in the blank frames, but adjusted to those different levels so that we can really differentiate and give everybody what they need. So to wrap up, our last slide, revisiting our objectives. When we started this chat, we said that we were going to identify and acknowledge the current situation. Check. I hope we've done that clearly. We have found out how the learning loss situation is addressed in different teaching contexts. We saw remediation, acceleration. We spoke about some of the techniques that STEM learning suggests, and we saw 10 different low prep differentiation strategies and a flow for our lesson plan in which we combine whole group and small group work. So I hope that this has given you some ideas. And to wrap up, maybe in the chat box, you could write one thing, one idea, something that you think you may want to try as soon as you get back to class and which you think will help with the learning loss that we are all experiencing. It's not you, it's not me, it's happening everywhere. So would you like to type there into the chat box. One idea that you are taking with you, something that you would like to try in your classes and which can help you with learning loss. And Will, I don't know if you have any other questions or if there's anything in particular that you would like to bring up now.
Yeah, we have had a question. So someone's asking how to fit this into the schedule. So I mean, basically with anything that goes on top of the curriculum, it's about squeezing it in somewhere, isn't it? And finding the time, or making it sort of part of the philosophy, I suppose, of lesson planning. But what advice would you give for someone who's obviously trying to squeeze this in?
Exactly. Well, rather than squeeze it in, using this flow is actually a replacement. Whatever the schedule, using this flow of whole group, small group, whole group, small group, in which, thank you, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. This becomes the schedule. Mm-hmm. This becomes the way to make the curriculum objectives clear and attainable. Because squeezing in more might not really do the trick. It's just putting in more things. While this, the proposal is to change the approach and to use as many of the 10 differentiation strategies that I mentioned, following this flow.